friends. We're getting in the holiday spirit here at the Allender Center, and we have a special gift for you. From Thanksgiving to New Year's Eve, all of our online courses are on sale. This is the biggest discount we offer throughout the entire year. If you have been considering taking one of our courses, such as To Be Told, a course that guides you through knowing your own story, or the Marriage Online Course with Dr. Dan Allender and Dr. Steve Call, now is the time to sign up. All of the online courses from the Allender Center are self-paced, and you get lifetime access, so you can go through them anytime you'd like. Online courses from the Allender Center are a wonderful option if you're looking for a meaningful gift for someone special. Plus, they're delivered straight to your inbox, so you don't have to wait on shipping. Visit theallendercenter.org/offerings and click on online courses to get our best prices of the year now.
Thank you for listening to the Allender Center podcast. I'm Dr. Dan Allender.
And I'm Rachel Clinton Chen. We're fiercely committed to providing hope and healing to a fragmented world.
And restoration for the heart.
Thank you for joining us. Let's get this conversation started.
Well, it is awfully near Christmas, and I don't think there is a sweeter, more compelling holiday, a more, shall we say, significant period that is both honored and in some ways ignored. And today, I've got a sweet gift to be able to introduce you all to someone whom I've just come to know and also deeply already appreciate, and that is Alexander John Shaia. And to begin this conversation, Alexander John, your history is such that alone, as I said to you, we could spend the entire time talking about the journey and evolution of your own presence, thought, and invitation to the gospel. But as a clinical psychologist, as a spiritual director, as both a author, speaker, but as a man whose engagement with the Incarnation, engagement with Christmas has just such a compelling and life-giving presence. Just would love for you to introduce yourself better than what I've just done as to who you are and how you have come to be here, and particularly as you wind us into the conversation about the Incarnation, how that has been central to your understanding of life itself. So again, welcome.
Thank you, Dan, and hello to everyone who's listening. I'll sort of start in the middle of the story because I spent my years in Seattle in the mid-'70s through the early '80s. I did a grad program at Seattle U and then stayed. But I was born in Birmingham, Alabama in the 1950s, and my family had immigrated from Lebanon. My grandparents came to the States bringing my parents as children. And they settled in Birmingham because Birmingham in the early 1900s was a boom town. And many, many, many immigrants came into Birmingham. And then after World War I, what was a boom town became a bus town.
Yeah.
And what happened was that the industrial barons of Birmingham sort of gave the golden handshake to the KKK, who literally ran the city for about 50 years. And my childhood was a time where the KKK was certainly we know the oppression of American blacks. What we don't often recognize is that they also were oppressing Catholics, and they were oppressing Jews, and they were oppressing anyone who came from the Mediterranean.
Right.
Which, because my family was Catholic and Lebanese, we were essentially put into a ghetto in the south side of Birmingham, and So it was very interesting for me to grow up in this Lebanese village, which was the gift of the KKK, even though I was in the industrial U.S. South. Mm. But it gave me a chance to see the Middle East as it had been for 1,000 years, maybe 2,000 years. And the Christianity that I grew up with was an Eastern rite of the Roman Catholic Church called Maronite, but it's a far more mystical tradition than what much of Western Christendom in their beauty knows. So my experience in growing up in Christianity was we went to church literally with our lives on the line.
Yes.
There were church bombings. My grandmother's house was firebombed in 1957. Priests were killed. My father describes that Catholics in Alabama went to church before World War II at 4 o'clock in the morning and had to be home before sunrise because people would drive by Catholic churches and take down license plate numbers. So it was Christianity in my family was devout, but it was also, you knew that this wasn't a social club, that the choice of gathering with the community on Sunday meant something deep and treasured. And the other part of my life is that when I was born, my parents were not expecting a boy, but when I was born, my father looked at me and suddenly said, "He's Alexander." And the significance of the name is that in my family line in Lebanon, I come from a line of the family in the village that produces the next priest. So I have a series of 11 relatives going back to about the year 1300 that are all Maronite priests, and they all bear the name Alexander. So the next son that it was decided at birth that this was going to be your heritage, and in some sense your destiny, was given the name. And so in the midst of all of this, I was really raised with my father's rightful sense that I had this desire to bring together spirit and psychology. Those have always been my two passions, and it really fit me. And so I negotiated going to college as opposed to going to seminary immediately after high school. I went to the University of Notre Dame, and then after that, I went to seminary for a short while, came out of seminary, and then began to work full-time in the Roman Catholic Church, which is what brought me eventually to Seattle. So that just gives a small sense. I think I probably would add that my professors at Notre Dame were just incredible. And one of those professors at Notre Dame, teaching in the theology department as a visiting professor, was the U.S. mythologist by the name of Joseph Campbell, who had a tremendous impact on my understanding of my tradition and my understanding of Scripture.
Well, the heritage is so rich that in some sense, in the context of the severity of oppression, of indeed the danger, as you put it well, that this was not a social club. This was a heritage of both faith, but also profound family and Lebanese history and heritage. How did, I don't know how to put it better than, how did you become a priest without becoming a priest?
It's a really good question, and nobody's ever quite asked it that way, Dan. I've had this deep love of my tradition, and it has meant everything to my life and to my heart. It was the greatest sadness of my life that when I went to seminary, I found the seminary couldn't hold the depth of my questioning and my search. So when I left seminary, it was only a realization at that moment that this wasn't the right seminary for me. I still had this idea that I was going to find a better seminary, and I kept searching. But in the midst of that, I discovered that my priesthood was really going to be outside of the official ordained role, but that my work was going to be helping people reconnect with the depth of this incredibly beautiful holy tradition.
Yeah. Well, and again, we'll underscore access points to your labor and work. But as you have engaged, for example, the four paths through the realm of the four Gospels, it's both intriguing and also, in some sense, new without being new. That's one of the experiences I've had in both reading and encountering your work. There is something so vitally fresh about the gospel you invite us to, and yet it bears, shall we say, centuries and centuries, if not millennia, of that hard rock foundation. So given that this is our Christmas conversation, there are so many other things that I want to knock on the door of. But how did the Incarnation come to be as central for you as it appears to be?
Because of my Lebanese grandparents, in Arabic, my jiddo, grandfather, and sitto, grandmother, neither of them could read or write Arabic or English.
Wow.
And yet, to me, they are the wisest people of my life. And their faith was in the earth and in their heart and in what they did. And it didn't have the beauty of book learning. It didn't have all that incredible, articulate, intellectual construct. But I remember a few days after my grandmother's house was firebombed, that we were all together with her on a Sunday dinner, as we always were. And even in those days, there were some 70 of us crammed in this basement. And she always led us in grace. And none of us ever picked up our fork until she picked up her fork. And on that Sunday, after she ended grace, she looked around the room. And she looked at each one of us. And I was like 6 years old at this point. And she would just catch our eye and move on to the next person and the next person and the next person. And then finally, quietly and insistently, she said, "No hate, no hate, no hate." Then she picked up her fork. And there was something in that moment for me where I, as a 6-year-old boy, I was like, I want to know how to do that. I want to know how a woman whose husband had just died of a heart attack and now had lost her home with everything that she had brought from Lebanon, all the pictures of her family, all the mementos of her parents that she never saw again once she left. All of that was gone. And yet in that moment, her concern was about the family and how to move us forward. So I grew up on her lap. She didn't know English folk tales. She didn't know literature. She couldn't read Grimes to me, nor could she read the Bible to me. But what she did was she did what I assume is the way it had been in Lebanon for 2,000 years. She chanted the Gospels to me in a mixture of Arabic and Aramaic. And she chanted them by memory because that's how the people of Lebanon would learn the gospel text. In the poor villages, you memorize the chant on a Sunday. And though I couldn't fully understand the words, I learned from her that when you chant the text, there's a space in between the letters. There's a a music or a feeling that's conveyed that's more than just what the letters say. And that's what I experienced on that Sunday after the bombing of her house, where all of that chanting that she had done, I knew was true. It wasn't a story. It was the fabric of her heart. Mm. And from that moment, I wanted to know how to find that very fabric in my heart.
Mm. She lived the Incarnation. She is the presence of the Incarnation. And in some sense, she was filling the right hemisphere of your being with a sound and a poetic presence that feels like part of my early reading and listening to you. Is, one of the words I used prior to our conversation is that there is a poetic power that now makes a little more sense, that you have followed the rhythm of truth, in one sense, before the letter of truth. And in that, the combination is one that I would say with great heartache, most of us do not have the lyric presence of the Incarnation, a sense of the rhythm and the power of the presence of the Incarnation. It's a fact which transforms, indeed, but without, in some sense, the chanting power. So that is just sweet, but also I think for many of us creates already a kind of nostalgia of absence. That is, most of us have never had something quite comparable.
I was just going to say it's odd for me because I think my journey with Christianity has been the opposite of what most people's journey is. And that is, I lived in this mystical fiber of your heart Christianity until I got to college. And when I got to Notre Dame, I was befuddled, bewildered, confused. I couldn't find the Christianity there that I knew. I found these incredibly beautiful, brilliant intellectual concepts, but it didn't have the heart. And I had to go on my journey to find a way to bring that intellectual brilliance with the heart that I had been given in childhood. And I think that's largely my work. One of my books is called Heart and Mind. And it's like, I want for myself a Christianity which has the rigor of the intelligence, but also has the heartbeat, the fiber of one's heartbeat. So,
yeah. Well, again, because most of us know what chanting may sound like, the idea, again, of the presence of a powerful matriarch, an embodied presence of Jesus, being the lap, but also being the sound of the gospel. It has to open up a level of, again, connection into the unseen world that we long for. And indeed, I have that sense of the path that you have been given and that you have honored and taken is one that holds a complexity and yet as well just an immense simplicity. So as we begin to talk about Christmas, I'd love for you to talk about how you talk about Christmas to young ones, including someone like me. How do you talk about Christmas to children?
Oh, it's a really good question because I've got a great niece and a great nephew that are in that young generation. I want to talk to them about the type of radiance that we see in the night and the type of radiance that we see in the day. And I love to sit with them in the nighttime and look at the stars and look at the moon And I want to help them recover the earliest tradition of Christianity, which was the nighttime is the place where God rebirths us, reknits us. I hope that I would in no way, I don't want to confuse people or offend people by talking about the night is in some ways a feminine face of God. It's a womb-like face of our God, so that we can understand why Christianity continued the tradition from Judaism, from our mother tradition, that saw every day starting at sunset. And understanding that when night comes into our life, that a nighttime and a dark experience is not how we end, but it's how we begin again. And more than anything else, that's probably a thought that I keep trying to weave for my great niece and great nephew, because I want them to know that when we have a difficult time, that when we have challenges, that these are to be expected. They're part of the journey, and that they're places for us to begin again, not to despair and to end the journey. And so Christmas, for our earliest ancestors, was a time where they brought the cycle of night and day together with the incredible story of Jesus the Christ's birth. And they married these two because they wanted it to be a story of incarnation that we actually felt in our bodies. And they're two cycles that come together at Christmas. The Northern Hemisphere has both cycles. The Southern Hemisphere only has one cycle. But in the Northern Hemisphere, Christmas is today 3 days past the winter solstice. And that has tremendous significance. One of the things that we have lost is, yes, in fact, Christianity initially set Christmas Day as the day of the winter solstice. Because in the Julian calendar, which began in the year 45 BC, that the winter solstice was December the 25th. But in the 16th century, because that old calendar had only 362 days a year, and we know that it's roughly 365 days and a small fraction to make a one round of the sun. The calendar was all out of whack. And actually, winter now had become June. And so when the new calendar was created, they had to add 3 days to it. And the Roman Church was the one that created this new calendar. It's called the Gregorian calendar. Roughly started in about 1560. But now it created this enormous discussion because many of the Christian feasts had been chosen off of the sun calendar and what was happening on that day in the old 362-day-a-year calendar. But with the new calendar, the sun calendar and the Christian feast calendar would be 3 days off.
Right.
And how are we going to resolve this? What were we going to do? Were we going to change the Christian feasts and put them 3 days earlier, or are we going to keep them on the traditional date, but it would be 3 days off from the sun calendar? And here's the answer, which I think is so beautiful. And it starts with the winter solstice. If you know what the word solstice means, sol is sun, stis is still. So at the winter solstice and at the summer solstice, it's 3 days before the naked eye can perceive that the sun is either increasing or decreasing. Well, with the new Gregorian calendar, You have the night of the winter solstice on December 21st or December 22nd. And 3 mornings later will be the day when, for us in the Northern Hemisphere, we can actually perceive with the naked eye that light and radiance is now increasing. And so for that physical effect in the Northern Hemisphere, and also the beautiful story of Jesus being in the tomb 3 days, we kept the connection with the sun calendar. We in no way were embarrassed by marking or noting the winter solstice, but we used nature itself to also tell an interior and a deeper truth. Nature tells us every year when we come to the winter solstice that at the deepest dark, there's a turnaround.
Yes.
And our spiritual tradition tells us that when our lives, interior lives, are in the deepest dark, look for, wait, and prepare for the fresh radiance.
It's the holding, even in the incarnation, of the presence of death and resurrection, and that darkest of the dark, but also the glimmer. But there's something even stronger than the word glimmer. It's indeed the invitation that darkness will not prevail, and that feels like that alone ought, I'll say that strongly, ought to bring us to a point again of marveling about, in so many ways, the wisdom of those who have come before us to hold that together.
So I know that for us, and I will go, I hope this year, to see my great niece and great nephew in a Christmas pageant and to see the beauty of the story told in that way. But I also want to tell us another way that early Christians, and for centuries, we told the story of Christmas in a slightly different way. And that is remembering that Christmas begins at sunset on December the 24th. That as soon as nightfall happened, we would read the genealogy of Matthew. And that genealogy has within it the story of people who lived in difficult days.
Yes.
Who lived in days that we might call a dark time or a dark season. And yet they stayed faithful. And something happened in that dark time that was very unexpected. And that God remains with us. So that is the Christmas gospel, just the genealogy, right after sunset. And then we, as early Christians, would go later in the night, maybe 10 o'clock, maybe midnight, and we would tell the next story deep in the night. And that would be from the Gospel of Luke. And it would be the angel announcing to the shepherd that there has been a birth. And this is the gospel for so many of us right now in our life who feel that we may be living through a dark season. And I love that the angel comes to the shepherd. And as we know from our research on first century shepherding, the shepherd of the first century is not the great hero of 1,000 years earlier. The shepherds are difficult. They are much like the places in us that are wounded, hurt, despairing, maybe some manner of addiction, trauma. This is where the angel comes, because the shepherd are an image of the nighttime experience. And they receive this announcement of a birth, a holy birth, of fresh radiance. Okay, then we go on, early Christians. Now we come to dawn and Christmas morning. Now we pick up the story from Luke again, but now we tell the story of the shepherds come to the manger and they see. And this is matched by the fact that we too, standing on Christmas morning, are now perhaps standing in the fresh, increased radiance of the sun, which is helping us know and experience the fresh and increased radiance of the inner SON. And then we have a fourth gospel, which is what we would read or tell later in the full light of Christmas Day. And that fourth and final gospel of Christmas is the incredible poetry of John's prologue that reminds us that the Christ has always been and will always be.
The richness, again, of what I asked you to engage, in some ways, the notion that the shepherds, if we can start there again, the shepherds are not, as they appear, at least in our church's pageant, they are the fresh-faced young 8 to 12-year-olds, the boys and the girls with bathrobes, essentially, and they are just darling. And to be able to say, oh no, come on. What we know is that these would not have been your most valued citizens in that day. And again, to try and compare them to any particular group would not be terribly helpful. But I've often thought of them as essentially bar denizens, maybe those who are bouncers. You're basically in the context of the least desirable, other than being a prostituted woman, least desirable occupation. So that alone, and then to make the connection of these are not just people, they are a reflection of who we are. That is a really, really important connection. And in that, the invitation is to say, no wonder they were stunned, not just by the brightness and the audacity of the unseen world making itself known, but to them in particular. And how do you engage that part of you as you come into the Christmas season?
Well, and let me just step a step back, Dan, because I live in an area with many shepherds. I've also lived and worked in New Zealand, and the shepherd is an incredibly gifted and skilled person who knows how to care for these actually incredible beings. And I also know that in the Gospel of John, the text has to tell us the good shepherd. And the reason it has to say the good shepherd is because we are looking at a time in the first century, a very tragic time,
yes,
where the Roman Empire had forced people into the cities and had thought of those in agrarian life as less than. And that anyone who had offended the culture or had done anything which was considered that they would be shamed, they were made to go and work in the fields with the sheep, because people who work with the sheep will smell of the sheep. And smelling of the sheep was more effective than having a bell around your neck. Wherever you went, everyone knew you have broken a taboo, you have broken a rule. You're not allowed in polite society. So when it comes to Christmas, I always want to think of how in the beautiful scene, how I touch the holy angelic, but how that holy angelic has also come to touch that place in me that's raw, unformed, needy, all of those things that I probably would prefer not to think about being. And yet so much of my vitality is locked there until I know that it's there and I know how to walk with it. and I know how to offer it transformation.
Yeah. Again, you're speaking of a kind of kindness to those very broken parts of us. And back to the word oppressed parts of us. So oppression has been a pretty central theme to your life experience, it would seem. And having that sense of what it means to bear shame, but not bear shame, to be able to bear it without, in one sense, condescending to the parts that are ashamed, but actually being able to see within it something life-giving and present. Is that a fair reading?
I hope that that's a fair reading, and that's my greatest desire, is to take the difficulty that I've experienced. I'm not alone. We all have that place of difficulty in us somewhere. And to know that it's the fertile soil of something far more radiant.
That there is something about the Incarnation, no matter how we frame it, that there is a transition from glory to humanity. And not to say that humanity doesn't bear its own glory, because we're made in the image of God. Yet there is a descent. There is a taking on. And in that, already it feels like the Incarnation is a disruption of shame, a bearing of our oppression, a bearing of the reality of flesh. And in that glory becoming flesh, there is a beginning to a disruption of the shame complex. And that is, in and of itself, that intersection between the dark night, yet there is the beginning of visible light. That is just sweet. And before we end, there's so much more to be covered. I just can't have hard time without you talking about the Christmas tree, because I've always, Tree of Jesse never made that much sense to me. Whatever. But as you've talked about the tree in other settings that I've heard, it's like for the first time I went, oh my gosh, I cannot wait to get a tree.
Yeah. So here's the deeper story. And that is when the Christian world meets the Celtic world. And the Celtic world in those days went from what is today Ireland to at least Russia. And now archaeologically, we find evidence of the Celts in China.
Wow.
But this whole swath of Northern Europe is largely bound in the great symbol of the sacred tree. But in those early days, the sacred tree was the oak tree. And it's not until the great oak forests of Europe are decimated that the pine tree or the fir tree becomes, or the evergreen becomes the great tree. So on the day before the winter solstice, again, the winter solstice in that time was December the 25th. On December the 24th, the Celts are decorating the bare limbs of the sacred oak tree, usually in the center of the village or in some sacred grove near the village. And what they are doing is they are hanging dried fruits in this sacred oak, and they are preparing the oak to be an image of rebirth that will be celebrated on the next day on the winter solstice. Well, when our Christian ancestors see this and hear the story, they go, oh, well, we know this story. We know the story of the tree in the garden. And we know the story of the fruit on that tree. Mm-hmm. And we know that in the birth of Jesus the Christ, the garden is open again. And the tree is there for our nurturance and our sustenance. And so we make December, in the ancient Christian calendar, December the 24th was the feast of Adam and Eve. Mm-hmm. And on this day, we gathered a tree that would help us remember the garden. And we initially adorned it with fruits to help us recall the story of that garden in Genesis and the fact that in Christmas, the gates are open.
Again, the sweetness of the decimated tree being, in one sense, given a life again, and then a life again into a restoration of what was lost in Eden, and yet the holding again of the tree of life and the trees that will one day populate the boulevard with 12 trees that are comparable to the one in Eden. In some sense, every time we put the tree up, what we're proclaiming is that as perfect as Eden was, the new heavens and earth, which we get to participate in Jesus now, is actually even better. So that's enough to be able to say, oh my goodness, may this be for you. And I hope for our audience, just even having these categories, an even more sweet and rich Christmas than what it might have been. So, Alexander John, thank you so much. And I trust that there will be many opportunities in the future for us to be able to play in the realm of redemption together.
I trust so, Dan. And I want to remind all of us that if on Christmas Day you don't feel the outer Christmas, know it's on the way.
It's on the way. Indeed. By itself, it is the promise. It's on the way.
The Allender Center podcast is produced by the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology.
If you'd like more information about the Allender Center, you can look at theallendercenter.org.